In the sweltering summer heat of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg trembled underfoot, not from the rumbling of horses or the march of soldiers, but from something far more sinister. It began with a single woman, her body jerking unnaturally, her feet pounding the cobblestones in a frenzied rhythm. The town watched in confusion as her dance continued into the night, her face frozen in a twisted expression of agony and helplessness. By morning, others had joined her, their limbs flailing, their bodies moving as though controlled by some invisible puppeteer. Days passed, and what started as a few dancers swelled into hundreds. Their faces were pale, their eyes vacant, yet they danced without end, their bodies exhausted but unable to stop. Spectators stood helpless, hearing only the relentless beat of feet against stone, seeing the bloodied souls of those who had danced for too long. Whispers began to circulate. Was this the work of a curse? A divine punishment? Or something even darker? As the weeks wore on, the dancers began to fall. One by one they collapsed, their bodies broken from the relentless movement. Yet even in death, their legs twitched as if trying to dance on. Fear gripped the town. No one knew when the next soul would be claimed, or if the madness would ever end. And through it all, the unseen force driving the dancers remained a terrifying mystery. Would it spread beyond Strasbourg? Was there anyone left to stop it? And worst of all, was the town merely the stage for a much larger, more malevolent dance waiting to begin? There was no escaping the rhythm, no escaping the dance. Would you be next? The year was 1518, and Strasbourg, a bustling city along the Rhine River in what is now modern-day France, was preparing for another sweltering summer. But no one could have predicted what that summer would bring. The city, already on edge due to famine and disease, was about to experience an even more bizarre phenomenon. It would begin with a single woman, a housewife by the name of Frau Trophia, whose name would go down in infamy. On one otherwise unremarkable July day, Frau Trophia stepped out into the streets and began to dance. At first, those who saw her were bemused, assuming it was some strange whim or perhaps even a reaction to the oppressive heat. She moved without music, her feet stomping rhythmically on the ground, her arms twitching uncontrollably. But as the hours passed, it became clear that something was dreadfully wrong. Frau Trophia couldn't stop. Her body was moving of its own accord, as though possessed by an invisible force. Sweat poured from her brow, her clothes clung to her skin, but she danced on. By evening, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Some laughed at the spectacle, while others muttered in concern. Frau Trophia's face, however, was not one of joy. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic, her body trembling as she danced, as though she were fighting against whatever was controlling her limbs. Neighbors tried to intervene to hold her still, but her body resisted. Eventually the sun set, and yet she continued, dancing through the night. By the following morning, Frau Trophia was still dancing. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her limbs visibly shaking from exhaustion. But the terror had only begun. Soon, others began to join her. First, it was a few people, their bodies swaying and twitching to the same unseen rhythm. Within days, dozens were dancing, their faces contorted with fear, their bodies moving in time with Frau Trophia's tortured steps. The streets of Strasbourg were filled with the sound of shuffling feet, and no one could explain why it was happening. The town's authorities were baffled. They consulted local physicians, hoping for some rational explanation. But the doctors could only conclude that this was a case of hot blood, an imbalance of bodily humors that needed to be expunged through more dancing. In their desperation, the city officials erected a stage in the marketplace and even hired musicians, believing that if they encouraged the dancers to dance harder and longer, they would eventually tire themselves out and be cured. But the plan backfired. Instead of curing the afflicted, it seemed to spread the mania. The music only encouraged more people to join, and within a week, the number of dancers had grown to nearly 400. Their frenzied movements filled the narrow streets, and soon people began to fall. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion, their bodies convulsing and trembling even as they lay on the ground. Others continued to dance until they could no longer stand, their legs giving way beneath them. The once lively city had transformed into a macabre spectacle of bodies writhing uncontrollably, faces twisted in horror. The people of Strasbourg were terrified. They began to speak of curses, of the wrath of saints or demons possessing the dancers. Some claimed that Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr known for his association with dancing plagues, had cursed the city for its sins. Others believed that dark sorcery or demonic forces were at work. But no matter the explanation, one thing was clear. The dancing plague was not stopping. It was growing worse. As the dancers' numbers swelled, so did the fear among the townspeople. People began to fear leaving their homes, worried they too might be struck by the strange affliction. Shops closed, markets were abandoned, and the once lively streets grew eerily quiet, save for the incessant shuffling of the dancers' feet. The city's religious leaders saw this as a sign of divine punishment. They organized processions and prayer vigils, begging the saints to lift the curse from their town. Some even took to whipping themselves in acts of penance, hoping that their own suffering might appease the wrathful forces that had taken hold. The dancers, however, were beyond the reach of prayers or penance. They continued their frenzied movements day and night, unable to stop even as their bodies began to break down. Some witnesses spoke of seeing strange figures in the crowds, shadowy apparitions that seemed to hover near the dancers, watching with unseen eyes. Others claimed to hear eerie, disembodied voices whispering in the dark, urging the afflicted to dance harder, faster, longer. Fear gripped the city, and with it came wild rumors. Some said the plague had been summoned by witches or sorcerers, others that it was a warning of the apocalypse. But no matter the reason, the nightmare continued. Weeks passed, and the death toll rose. Those who danced for too long collapsed from exhaustion, or succumbed to strokes and heart attacks. The bodies of the fallen were carried away, but still, the dancing continued. The rhythm of feet pounding the cobblestones became an inescapable sound that echoed through the streets day and night. As August wore on, it became clear that Strasbourg was losing control of the situation. The town's leaders, desperate for a solution, eventually turned to more drastic measures. They decided to seek out the intercession of Saint Vitus, the very saint many believed had cursed them. The authorities rounded up the afflicted dancers and transported them to a shrine dedicated to the saint, located in the nearby town of Saverne. There, the dancers were placed under the care of priests who performed religious rituals, hoping to exorcise whatever demonic force had taken hold of them. The dancers were made to wear red shoes and were led in a solemn procession to the shrine, where prayers and masses were offered in their name. Miraculously, after weeks of endless dancing, the strange plague began to subside. One by one, the afflicted stopped their frantic movements, their bodies finally still. By the end of September, the last of the dancers had collapsed, their ordeal finally over. But while the plague had come to an end, the terror it had wrought on Strasbourg would never be forgotten. Hundreds of people had danced themselves to the brink of death, and many never recovered from the physical or psychological trauma. The town, once vibrant, now carried the weight of a dark, unexplainable event that defied all reason. Theories about what had caused the dancing plague still abound to this day. Some suggest it was a form of mass hysteria, brought on by the stress of famine, disease, and religious fear. Others believe it was caused by ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus found in rye bread that can produce hallucinations and convulsions. But none of these explanations fully account for the sheer scale and duration of the plague. To this day, the Dancing Plague of 1518 remains one of history's most terrifying and mysterious events, a forgotten horror that, like the dancers themselves, refuses to be still. Would you be able to resist the dance? The strange and terrifying events of the Dancing Plague of 1518 have puzzled historians and scientists for centuries. How could an entire town be overtaken by such an inexplicable and bizarre affliction? Was it truly a case of mass hysteria, or was there something darker, more malevolent at play? As time passes, we may never know the full truth behind the events that transpired in Strasbourg. But one thing remains clear: the fear, confusion, and suffering that gripped the town left a lasting scar, a chilling reminder of how fragile our grip on reality can be. And as we look back on these events, we can only wonder, what would happen if such a phenomenon were to return today? Would we recognize the signs before it was too late? Or would we, like the people of Strasbourg, be swept up in the madness, unable to stop ourselves from succumbing to the invisible force that drives us to the brink of destruction? The eerie rhythm, the compulsion to move, to dance, could it resurface, perhaps under different guises, in our modern world? And if it did, would anyone be able to break the cycle, or would history repeat itself as we spiral into a new forgotten nightmare? The thought lingers, unsettling, a reminder that sometimes the darkest mysteries of the past remain just beneath the surface, waiting for their moment to return.